Meeting will resume. Like to know whether Mr. Leung Yiu-chung has anything to ask the administration. Well, Chairman, you can see what has happened, and the deputations have told us that the reality is showing a very poor situation. Tenants have to face crazy rent increases, and the interval between rent increases has become shorter. It used to be 2 years and then 1 year, and now half a year or even just a few months. And the notice period has also been shortened. Sometimes the notice is given only a few days before people have to move out. How can you solve the problems? Is it as what you said in the last 2 sessions, that you only lay bare the positive and negative views and then let things just go on like that? What is your next step? The reality shows us that tenants are facing huge difficulties. And by the end of the year, you say you may be making proposals, but how will those proposals be? Are you really going to provide solutions? Or are you just saying, I'll think about it, let's see what we can do about it? Is it that if society tells you to do nothing, you do nothing? So you have finished? Yeah, this is my question. Ms. Wong, would you like to respond? Thank you, Chairman. As I said, and also at the last HP meeting, the Secretary said we do not have a conclusion now. In the paper submitted to the panel, we told you the findings of our study, which was requested by the panel. We took stock of overseas experience, our own experience, and also views for and against rent control. If you ask us for a conclusion today, I have no answer, because today we are here to listen to the deputations and individuals. This is an important step. As I said, we hope by the end of the year, when we have the LTHS, we will also give an account of this issue. So if you ask me today, we do not have a conclusion. But we are here to listen. This is part of the process. Chairman, can I ask a simple follow-up? There are a few more months before the end of the year. Will you do a more in-depth study to see whether we do need rent control for the present situation? Can you do an in-depth study and tell us the objective finding? Don't speak from intuition. Your study is problematic because you use overseas experience as reference, but then many things are different between Hong Kong and overseas countries. Just look at social welfare and housing policies. We don't use the same starting point. And if you only take out rent control out of context, that will be biased and incomplete. I think the reference is not useful. I can give you an example. I remember I talked to Mr. C.H. Tung many times about minimum wage, and he said to us, looking at overseas experience, SMW is not feasible because with SMW, there would be more people unemployed. That's for sure, he said. If 5 people work on 5 jobs, but with SMW, there will only be 2 to 3 people working the 5 jobs, and because the bosses won't hire so many people. And he said that was the painful experience overseas. That is why he would not adopt SMW. But now we have SMW in Hong Kong. We have had it for 3 years. Our unemployment rate has not gone down. It has not gone up, but it has gone down. So you cannot take things out of context. Is that appropriate? This is just one example. I can cite many more examples for you. Now you always quote experience overseas to counter us, saying that a lot of negative consequences will take place. But just look at our local situation. Do a study of the Hong Kong situation and let us know the findings. Ms. Wong. Thank you, Chair. We of course understand that overseas experience should not be just copied to Hong Kong. That is why in our paper, we have also recounted what happened in Hong Kong when we had rent control. We also listed local commentaries, both for and against rent control. Overseas experience, whether they are failures or successes, and whether there were unexpected results, they were just quoted in a truthful manner so that we can have a comprehensive discussion. We, of course, understand that the deputations have told us their situation. We understand that. We have no finalized view, but we must say and ask that we should be acting with prudence and caution, and whether rent control is the ultimate solution. I'm asking you to do a study. Will you do it? A study on the local situation. Ms. Wong? Actually, in the paper, we have already tried to list what we have reason to believe would happen. This is not just the government's view. It is also the view of many other people. We also said that when we seek to resolve problems, we want to have targeted solutions. And we are saying that we should be acting with care. So are you going to do the study? I'm asking you. Can you give me a direct answer, yes or no? Please answer again. I think in the paper we have already tried to recount the findings and results of our study, and we have heard the deputations today. Dr. Fernando Zhang, 5 minutes each, including a reply. Dr. Fernando Zhang, Chairman, many deputations came to reflect the difficulties people have with regard to housing. They live in very poor, unhygienic, and also small-sized SDUs. And yet the rent is so high. In the past few years, rent has surged. You have all the statistics. You have done a study as to how many people live in SDUs. You will admit that at least 170,000 people live in SDUs. Housing problem is a problem that should be resolved ASAP, and on a daily basis, tens of thousands of people are in that kind of poor situation. Deputies are asking for rent control because, in the very least, they hope there would be a cap to the rate of rent increase so that they can have a bigger sense of security.
And they will not be evicted any time. The protection for the tenant is so inadequate. So they are rendered no sense of security, no security of tenancy. If you say if a rent allowance is provided, the money will go to the landlord. And for PRH, it's for the long term. You cannot hope to get the necessary units today. So what can be done? And the question should not have been answered. Should not be answered by the Deputy Secretary. It should be by the political appointees. Well, there were so many meetings that I had to attend. I'm sorry that I could not stay for the deputations for the entire duration. So, Deputy Secretary, all the proposals are said to be not feasible by you. So what are you going to do? What can you do to solve the problems before us? Deputy Secretary, I believe the Secretary did reply to the members. And that is the key is supply. Last year there was a survey of SDU dwellers. More than half of them are applying for PRH. If we can increase the PRH, supply of PRH, it's going to be the solution in the longer term. And in the meantime, certainly we can improve on what we have been doing. Yesterday, there was the announcement that the supply this year of PRH will be lower than expected. When we need to identify sites and we need to consult people over the PRH program, and the time taken is relatively longer. But the ultimate solution always lies in increasing supply. And some people have asked us for the midterm or near-term solutions. But if you look at our experience and the experience of other places, well, tenancy control may be something out of a good intention, but there may be unintended consequences. But of course, there are successful examples, like Germany. Well, time is limited. Sorry for the interjection. You have been talking about increasing the supply of PRH. What about short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions? Don't tell us what cannot be done. Instead of telling us 20 things that you cannot do, why don't you tell us one thing that you can do? Well, if I have to be acting responsibly, I would have to say that I understand the aspiration and the needs, but I need to understand. I have to tell you the downside of the proposals. Well, a responsible government would respond to people's aspiration now, here and now. It's not the first day you assume your post. Mr. C.Y. Leung is a surveyor. Before he assumed the post of CE, he said Hong Kong people want to live in bigger accommodation and live in better housing better accommodation. And now the reverse is true. Please speak into the mic. First of all, I have to apologize to Ms. Wong. I was emotional because I allow myself to vent my anger on you. I shouldn't have done that. You are not a political appointee. We know that if you take a drug, there is also going to be some side effect. So that is also true of tenancy control. Actually, we need to spend money to solve the problem. Well, you should favor certain parties through certain policies. That is to say, you should provide some incentives to the market. If you do something about the taxation system, or if you provide something in cash, you provide cash incentive, you must properly regulate the system. Well, I know in Germany, they pay cash. Well, it's a carrot and stick approach for a tenancy control system. If the flat is left vacant or is sold for a profit within a short time, the profit should be subject to a higher tax. And you should offer tax concessions for people who let their property to tenants. You can do some adjustment through the taxation system. You may argue that we have a low and simple tax system. Well, you can increase the stamp duty rate by a few percentage points overnight. So is that not something tinkling with the taxation system? You are saying that we can use certain drugs, but the drugs are not available in the short term. So people want you to do something in the interim. If people cannot do it in other countries, you can always change it so that it will work in Hong Kong, even if it's just a sedative drug. You have to try some solutions. don't say that this is an intervention in the market, because what we are seeing now is a result of past intervention. So at the end of the day, it takes a market intervention to address the problems of past interventions. Mrs. Carrie Lam said she would like to produce 10,000 properly divided SDUs, but the Development Bureau couldn't deliver. And let's look at interim housing. People would like to have accommodation close to one's place of work. Well, we should provide smaller units nearer to the place of work rather than bigger and better accommodation, but farther away. Or you can allow people to build squatters. Or you can use short-term tenancies to allow people to build squatter huts. We understand that there is pain, and we want to use a painkiller. We're asking you to do the operation now. Well, don't blame people that they are criticizing you. You should blame the absentee, the person who shouldn't have been absent. So I hope you can faithfully reflect the views. The current situation is very bad. This is the important message. Something must be done. You cannot afford to do nothing. Mr. KK Fong, in the last meeting of the housing panel, we got the government report on tenancy control. And you look at the practices in other countries, they always have this premise of as little government intervention as possible. During the Donald Trump era, we didn't build many PRH units. We didn't provide sites for residential properties, and that's why we have this dire situation here. That's the result of past inaction on the part of the government. The rent increase is not reasonable. It's not something that you would expect in a reasonable market. Yes, you want to build more PRH units, but you can only increase the stock from 15,000 to 20,000 in 2018. So we can only expect more units starting from 2018, and the construction target would just reach 22,000, and that's insufficient. So in the coming 8 to 10 years, the problems with the private property market will not go away. So you want to build PRH. When can you deliver? Basically, the conclusion is that you are not going to do anything in the interim. If you say by 2018, all problems will be resolved, Mr. Fong, and then you just tolerate the high rent for another 4 years, can you make a promise like that? The rent has been distorted, and people are paying more in terms of rent than for other living expenses. How can you give people a sense of belonging? How can you expect people to regard Hong Kong as their home? And that's why people go out to protest. People criticize you. Well, so in other words, there are political consequences for inaction. Shouldn't there be some interim measures? We have mentioned the provision of interim accommodation. If you say we can solve the problem after 8 years, then what about in the meantime? If you have all kinds of measures, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the problems can be solved. But we are only going to get 5,000 more PRH units in 2018, and that's not sufficient to meet the demand. So what can the government do? The quickest solution is tenancy control. If you say, you give me the land, after 6 years, I can deliver the PRH units to meet the demand. There's no need to introduce tenancy control. But that's not the case. You cannot tell us when you can deliver the PRH units, but you just say that increasing the supply of PRH is the solution. I don't think anyone would accept this as a solution, as an answer. Well, if you say that 10 years down the road, through the increase in the supply of PRH, we can solve the problems, then I would say the tenancy control should be in place for 10 years and no more. Actually, in the policy address last year, the aim of the public housing program is very clearly set out, and I don't need to repeat it. The housing department is working very hard to meet that objective. But of course, I cannot do what Mr. Fong has asked and say that the problem can be resolved in a certain number of years, because there's an interactive process. Other parties are also involved. We have set ourselves the objective. Of course, if we don't do it now, don't do anything now, the objective cannot be met a number of years down the road. This morning, I mentioned that the deputations and some members has suggested the provision of a temporary or interim accommodation. I just wanted to point out that if we had sites that can be used for building interim accommodation, we would certainly have used it for public rental housing instead. Please continue. There are other suggestions, such as a rent subsidy or allowance. Professor Zhang, the secretary, did respond to this proposal. We have been saying that doing all these would entail certain consequences. Dr. Kokake, I don't know what you are doing here. Ms. Wong, if I were you, I would be ashamed of myself. The deputations have told you the problems and the difficulties they face. And of the government is aware of the problems and the inability to provide PRH. So after hearing them, you are just asking them to wait for the end to come.
Is that the government's attitude? Rent control can be implemented on different levels. You know, I understand you say it is difficult to set the rent. I understand that, but that is not the only problem. Many grassroots face unreasonable rent levels. That's the first thing. Number two, the housing market is distorted. They just want accommodation, but there is no policy to protect them. Say if they are charged $50 for a square foot in a subdivided unit, they just want to have a renewal of the tenancy, or they can have a reasonable notice period so then they can find alternative accommodation. But they are denying that. The notice period has become very short. And even if you say there should be a written agreement, all these are not going to affect the free market. But let me ask you this first question. With regard to the minimum notice period and a written agreement, what are your responses? Are you going to do that? DS? That has been mentioned by some speakers. Let me just make one point. If we want to do any of these, we have to do it by legal means or through legal amendments. Well, that I know, said Mr. K.K. Kwok. And in the process, even these are controversial, and it is doubtful whether these can be done immediately. So it's not just as simple as tenancy rights, because that is part of the package, including rent control. This is what experience tells us. So in terms of legislative amendments and in discussing the legislative amendments, maybe the owners would change their behavior already, and that's quite possible. So it's not that we don't understand the situation, but we must be very careful in making any step, because we don't want to see counter effects that we don't want to see happen. Well, the more you talk, the more outrageous your ideas have become. If there is no controversy in the world, we don't need any arguments or discussion. The political reform is quite outrageous. As you are proposing it, you still want to push it through, and NENT again is very controversial, and still you pushed it through. Are you going to do it only when there is no controversy? What is not controversial here at LegCo? I had wanted to be polite and calm and to listen to you, but then you are telling me that you are just sitting there without doing anything and you are letting people die. There is no housing. There is no temporary housing. And they are making this so very modest request that you should set a minimum notice period. You are not even committing yourself to looking into it. You say it is very controversial. So let's just say we stop talking to these officials. It's a waste of time. They do not have any conviction. You don't even have the motive. Maybe your salary is too high and your accommodation is too good. You just don't know the plight of the grassroots. Have you been to an SDU? Can I ask you that? When have you been to an SDU? Have you been to partitioned rooms? You are such a high-ranking housing official. Have you been to a partitioned room? DS, answer me. Any response? When I was studying, I went to a cage house. When was that? How many years there have been since your graduation? Dr. Kwok. No, Chairman. Well, don't question the official personally. Don't impute motives to officials. I don't think it's very good. You can make use of arguments to criticize the situation. Well, let me ask a question. I now give you some latitude. Just say one thing or two things to respond to the demands of the grassroots vis-a-vis rental control and the laws attending to this. What will you do? Yes, as I said in the last session, today we are here to listen to views. Okay, you have already listened. Yes, we have listened. And later on in the LTHS, we will give an account on this issue as well. Thank you. Now I make use of my 5 minutes as a legislator. Today, we have heard over 100 deputations and individuals, even if some have not turned up. We heard that in the private rental market, the plight of people who live in substandard SDUs. I hope the two officials can summarize the views reflected by the deputations and individuals and write a paper. In other words, you summarize their situation, experience, and also difficulties. We have heard very touching stories. They are paying higher rent. They are living in smaller and more remote accommodation. They have a decreasing sense of security because their tenancy may not be reviewed and rent can go up at any time. As the administration, you should write a paper and give an account of what you heard today. And at the same time, you should also record what the deputation said. They have no tenancy agreement to protect them. They have no security of tenure. In other words, they are not protected by any objective criteria. They are suffering at the expense of the one holding the property right or the intermediary. In their own words, the market has failed. The market is distorted. This is what the tenants are facing. Plus, quite a number of them are applying for PRH. However, they have been waiting for many years. And they are now facing these undesirable living conditions. Now, what should we do for them? I hope that after listening to them, the administration can summarize the situation and write a paper and then consider what you can do to help them. Plus, they also said, since they are paying more rent but living in smaller and more remote accommodation and also in buildings without lifts, that means when they move, they have to pay more removal fees because the furniture has to be lifted up flights of steps. We are an economically advanced metropolis, and we really have to look into this. So can you comply with that request? That you collect the views into a paper and then for you to consider what can be done. Can you do that, Diaz? Chairman, are you saying that we summarize the views and then we respond to that in a paper? Yes, we can do that when we go back. And then, apart from the views you heard today, I in fact also want you to do some information collection and also investigation, because the deputations may just be reflecting part of the situation and they have not reflected the entire comprehensive picture. Maybe through your department, you can also seek other information and summarize those as well. I think we can see what we can do. Okay. Second round, Dr. Fernando Zhang. Chairman, over 100 deputations have come today. Grassroots face very poor living conditions, and in fact, we have talked about that for so long. C.Y. Leung and his administration have been in post for 2 years. I will now give all the time she needs to the DS to address the concerns of the deputations. As a responsible administration, what are you going to do? What can you do to help these residents in tackling the problem? DS, I think I can only say that today I may not be able to give you any answer to your liking. I can only say that in the long term, there will be supply of public housing, that's for sure. As for the other proposals, we will have to go back and give it some detailed thinking. I cannot give you an immediate response now because, as I said, many proposals would lead to different consequences and we have to act with caution. But we'll go back and take a look. How much time do you need? Yes, Chairman. I think we discussed before, right here at the panel. We cannot come back with quick answers. But as I said, in the LTHS, we will come up with a view. Mr. Zhang, actually she said many times that by the end of the year, the LTHS would be finalized, and that would include rent control. I'm not talking about LTHS. I'm talking about the residents who have appeared today and who are in dire straits. Their children are affected by fleas that bite them all over the body. Take a look at them. Take a look at their present living condition. Tonight, the temperature is going to be over 30 degrees, and they live in SDUs which are hotter than outside. How do you expect them to continue to live there? I'm talking about now. I'm not talking about the long term. But then this is not a problem that has happened only today. It has been with us for many years. Shouldn't the administration act now? They are faced with sudden eviction by their owners. They are faced with rent increases. And the owner can say, tomorrow you have to pay more tariff. And there is the government, which should be responsible, has come to know this. And the new government has been with us for 2 years. The deputations have put forward specific views. They ask for rent control. You say you cannot do it. Okay, fine. Vacant flat tax, you say you cannot do it. Fine. There are many things you cannot do. Just now, Dr. K.K. Kwok asked how you can monitor the tenancy agreements so there would be a mutually agreed notice period. You say you can't do it. You can't do it in the short term. So what can you do in the short term if you are a responsible government? Do you just want to stare with wide open eyes how our poor grassroots people are living? Is it that you have to wait for the final supply of sufficient PRH and you can just sit there today? If that's the case, say it. I hope you will let the public know that this is the government you are. I'm talking about now. I'm talking about yesterday, the year before last, when you should have acted. I'm talking about C.Y. Leung. And he should have done something once he assumed his position. DS? Let me just add briefly. In Annex F of the paper, we tell you what we are doing. CSSA, CCF, and other measures. If there is more, I am sorry, I cannot tell you more. But apart from building PRH, the administration has done something to help the low-income groups. Those are in the paper. But if those measures have been effective, there will not be so many deputations coming today. This is because what you are doing is insufficient, Chairman. I think our panel should be able to do something, which is to allow residents who have the need to come and express their views. Hopefully the administration would hear them and then give a response. I don't expect you to give me all the answers today, but I can hear that you have no plans and no timetable. In that situation, I can only say that this is regrettable. Those accountable officials are not here. I cannot see that this government has the heart to help residents tackle their housing problem.
No more supplement? All right. Well, then, meeting's adjourned. Thank you for coming. And this is also the last meeting for the current session. I'd like to thank the Secretariat for their support. I'd like to thank the officials for attending our meetings. And I also thank members for their attendance. Meeting's adjourned.